Well, hello everybody. Welcome once again to another of our series of In Conversations. And I don't think we've ever done one which has been more topical, because today we're going to hear about the work of ABHI's international group, and we're recording this in the run up to Easter 2025. And never before, I don't think, has there been so much focus on trade and the technicalities of doing business on the global stage, following the Trump administration's decision to put import tariffs on just about every jurisdiction on the planet, including some of those which are uninhabited by humans, which has had everyone scrambling around, scratching their heads and trying to work out which way's up. We'll get to that as much as we can on this call, not least because by the time we finish recording this, let alone getting it out on the YouTube channel, the situation will probably have changed. But more of that shortly. So I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Thelwell, who is the chair of ABHI's international group. Andrew, before we get started, what we always like to do is just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and anything that's relevant to you being here on this call with me today.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Richard, for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted. And as you said, it's an incredibly topical time to have this conversation. So my background is, well, first of all, my role at the moment is COO, so Chief Operating Officer for a company called First Kind, which is an SME, UK based. And over 90% of our business is international trade. So I've always definitely got a big interest in this area. Prior to that, in my career, I've worked for 14 years for Smith & Nephew, 10 years for Convatec, worked for an Australian company that was importing into here. And then my current company, as I say, has got a very strong export role. So I think that gives me a really good insight into large companies, large corporations, and how they operate globally, and also small companies and how they have to operate globally, and really different priorities, sometimes different resources, but also some overlaps. So I was delighted to be involved in ABHI's international efforts. I was delighted to be asked to chair the group and try and bring that mixture of large corporate and SME experience together to make sure we're looking at the trade requirements across the whole membership of ABHI.
That's great. I mean, your background is really interesting. That, and I often speak to people from small companies like you're on at the moment, and they wonder what role they have to play in informing the government about its policies. And I said, well, a huge one. I mean, because you're hands-on technically, and I remember back to Brexit days, and we were trying to figure out flows of trade in and out of Europe, and a plea from colleagues in the Department of Trade at the time to stop sending them generalists like me who are into government affairs. They wanted to know people who knew what it was like technically, the difference between roll on and roll off and lift on, lift off, and what it was like to actually put containers on a ship. So that practical thing is very, very important. So you're obviously a great man to do this job for us. So Andrew, just tell us a little bit about the work of the International Trade Group and how you see it supporting companies.
Sure. So I'm very clear that the purpose of the group is to provide a focal point for all of the industry, whether you're a big company, medium-sized, small company. Try and capture all of the needs and requirements that you have, your goals, your ambitions, and really distill that down into areas that the ABHI International Group can meaningfully influence. So, there'd be 100 different issues relative to international trade. But what we're trying to really distill is what are that small number of things that everybody is interested in because it affects all of us. So to give you an example, the first priority that really emerges when you have that type of discussion amongst a diverse group is the one of regulatory and specifically regulatory alignment or harmonization. Um, uh, Larger companies may have the manpower and the money to deal with all of the different the territories and all of the different regulations and so on. As SMEs, it's very difficult if every single country in the world wants a different set of technical data, manufacturing reports, clinical data, etc. So trying to encourage our government to lobby globally to align the UK as best we can with other systems around the world is massively helpful. So there's an example of something, whether it doesn't matter whether you're big or small, that the more harmonization we have, the more streamlined the regulatory piece of this is, the better chance we all have of exporting in an efficient manner. And so there's an example for you of something that we can focus on as a group and an organization that helps everybody. Beyond that, prior to all of the tariff mayhem that you described earlier, we'd already identified our second biggest priority as being the issue of trade agreement. So prior to the last couple of weeks, there were some free trade agreements that were in place with certain states in the US, and that was of interest to members, plus any other trade agreements with other trading blocks around the world of particular interest. So I think the tariffs has really, again, been a lightning rod for focus, but it's within a wider topic of trade agreements and relationships, which was, as I say, our number two priority. In terms of others, you've then got two levels, two things that are going on. One is the Department of Business and Trade's own programme, where they have missions and they have certain initiatives and they can bring certain things to bear. But ABHI also has run a very successful programme itself for many years. And it's trying to sort of work as an international trade group to get the best out of the DBT programme and the best out of the ABHI programme, but also look at how those two things can work together in a more coherent manner. And then the final aspect, which I think is particularly relevant to SMEs, is one around signposting. There's lots and lots of advice out there for trade, but there's too much. And you can, if you're sitting in a company somewhere in the UK and you decide you want to go into international trade and you Google that, there's an astonishing amount of materials and you actually quickly get overwhelmed. And so one of the things the group would love to do is work with the people who are in this space, but really try and signpost in an easier, more accessible manner. How do you go from never having sold a product abroad to selling products abroad? Just that simple concept. Are there half a dozen steps that can be defined that just gets people underway, as opposed to being buried under a massive volume of things? So it's very much a stepwise approach, we believe. And we think collectively ourselves at ABHI with the international group, but also DBT as well, working with them, we can do a better job for UK companies, in our opinion. So they're the sort of key priorities of the group. The purpose is to take our top 5 priorities and to make sure that we get as much input from our members as we can, and then work with government and DBT in particular to get the absolute maximum out of those priorities.
Great. So you mentioned, I think 3 priorities there: regulation, and we talk a lot. If we were doing this call up just about regulation, we'd say this is a very, very topical one, because we're right into that pre-market regulation consultation at the moment, which is going to dictate that. You talked about the trade agreements. You talked about the signposting. Other priorities for the group?
I think the key, a lot of it is really around just trying to streamline the pathways and the processes. So what sort of things might you encounter? So you will encounter one of the things the group come up in the group is that different people have different views on parts of the world, but generally speaking, the US is important and remains important. But for some SMEs, it feels like too big a thing to take on. So the Gulf region, for example, I think everyone sees as more innovative. It's probably the more innovative your product is, the more likely they are to be one of your earlier markets. And then obviously we've got the question of mainland Europe and the issue of the reset. What does the reset look like, and so on. So I think there's it's about that environment. It's about what are we stepping into and what's it likely to cost us. So anything from the regulatory environment, the hurdles that we need to get over, but also how do we trade? How do we get products into that country? So all of those, we're trying to also think of it as a stepwise process. So what are all the stages in a logical order of how you'd get products in? And then you've got the questions of how can we help with practical delivery? So again, for SMEs, they might not have any representation in a region. So how do they make that first step? And that's where things like the events program can really help. Where, you know, for a reasonable cost, they can send people to a certain region, meet some people in a structured way, and that gets the ball rolling. So we're trying to help with the sort of the 30,000 foot things like regulatory and trade agreements, but we're also trying to help with those tangible things of, if I've never exported, how do I begin?
Great. So tell us just a little bit then about the events and activities we might expect to see from the group over the next year or so.
Okay. Well, I think ABHI has a number of special interest groups. So there is a regulatory group, for example, there is a market access group. All of these groups we will interface with. But from our point of view, I think the interface with regulatory and policy is absolutely critical. So I think people should expect to see the group really trying to focus on how, from a UK point of view, we can align our regulatory processes with other major systems around the world, and also how we can highlight to members programs like MDSAP, which is it's a regulatory program, but a number of dispersed countries around the world are signed up to that, places like Brazil and so on. And how can we really help members exploit those regulatory alliances? So I think that's going to be a big area of focus. We talked, Richard, about tariffs, and it's difficult for you and I sitting on this call to say where it's going to go and where it will end and so on. But I think broadly speaking, trying to understand our members' views on that. You know, simplistically, does the government in the UK do reciprocal tariffs or do something back? Or do we actually just concentrate on trying to get back to free trade kind of arrangement? So I think trying to make sure that we're representing members' views to government on that is critical. I think there's not a lot else we can say about that right now. We're influencing as much as we can influence, but broadly speaking, our goal as a group is to make sure that we have trade agreements with minimal tariffs with our major trading bloc partners. I think that's an objective we can say is there. There'll be a continuation of the events program that ABHI run, and certainly trying to influence that, make sure we're running that in the countries and regions that are a particular focus. So, and really trying to add on to those events, meetings with key players in those markets. So not just attending and standing on your exhibition booth, but having the opportunity to meet and listen to people, key players in the government there or in the health system there and so on. So it really is that step up for companies trying to engage in those markets. But also the missions. Since 2018, there's been a very, very successful mission program to the US. Over 100 companies have benefited. Over 150 million pounds worth of trade can be traced to those missions. And there's a new mission program in the Gulf region, which we're all very excited about, and we believe will be a strong contributor to business there as well. So I think the US and Gulf programs for missions will run and will be very helpful for members. But we're absolutely taking soundings from our members all the time about which other individual countries may be a target for the majority of our members, and therefore we would look to extend both the event program and the mission program accordingly. So I think the other thing I would say on that is bringing in Department of Business and Trade, because they run some similar initiatives or overlapping initiatives. And I think members feel that there could be a greater harmonisation between the industry and DBT in terms of which geographies are being focused on by DBT and how we use their resources. I've been to Arab Health many times. There's an event where, you know, you go to the British Embassy. Would people think that was a bit cliche? Doesn't really matter, because what I can tell you, having been there multiple times and being on the ground with customers, with people in the health systems, an invitation to the British Embassy still has huge power. So if we can better align where that happens and initiatives like that supported by DVT, but at events that ABHI and ABHI members are attending, then that harmonisation is, I think, what we can do better. And we're really trying to encourage DBT to engage with us on that so that we get the absolute biggest bang for our buck from for the members that are trying to export.
Yeah, great. So obviously, lots of opportunities there, Andrew. We talked about the US, obviously. Interestingly, I've met very few companies that I don't want to be in the US, and it's usually just down to their product portfolio. They have a
Exactly.
portfolio that doesn't suit the US market. If is there any opportunity that particularly jumps out at you, or if you're a small company thinking about, well, where do I go first? Any top tips?
Oh, good question. I would say it starts with what is the goal of your company. So that start with the end in mind principle. Um, so if small companies want to just build up their business over time, and it's a family entity or it's stable ownership or it's just going to be a long-term build, then you can I mean, you're never going to really look beyond a focus on the US or a focus on mainland EU. They're the biggest two trading blocks. They're the obvious places to go. But there are definitely opportunities, I would say, in the Gulf region. And of course, there are opportunities demographically in Asia. But the challenge with Asia at the moment is each country needs its own regulatory approval. So we could really benefit from some harmonization with Asia or within Asia. That would, I think, increase things. So you're probably going to start off with trying to build a business in the UK and then Europe, US. Uh, if you are one of those small companies that wants to interest a medium-sized company or a larger company, so you see the game being acquired by a larger entity, very difficult not to have a presence in the US, because the facts of the matter are the larger companies want to know whether they can be successful with your technology in the US. So at a minimum, I think you have to engage with that system. I think you have to try and get FDA approval. So we're back to regulatory, but then you have to build up at a minimum some key opinion leaders, some reference centers, and so on. Tip there would be, it really is you don't have to say I'm conquering the US. If you go there and you work in one state and you can generate reference centers, key opinion leaders, and business in one state, it's scalable. So I think that's the point I would make. I think the more innovative your product, the more likely you need to focus on the Gulf because they will adopt your innovation probably earlier than some areas, including, dare I say, our home country. So I think you've really got to think about, yeah, are you building a long-term business or are you looking to ultimately sell the business down the line? That impacts US or not potentially. And then whether you're innovative or not impacts your focus on the US again as an adopter of innovation and the Gulf as an adopter of innovation versus other markets which might be slower to build. Innovation's a little bit harder to do, but if you've got the time, that's okay. So there's some of my thoughts on how the geographies work. But again, partly my experience, partly listening to our members in the international group. Some are very big on the US, some are small on the US because they think it costs too much. Some are big on mainland Europe because we're spending all the money on MDR, so we need, something back for that. Other people at the moment find Europe a difficult environment and are looking to what the government's reset program brings. So that's generally where we are. Latin America, attractive, but tends to be built around the big blocks. Asia, attractive again, but tends to be built around the big blocks. So there's a sort of where do I go in the short term? Where do I go in the medium term? Where do I want to be in the long term? So it's sort of just having two or three frameworks and saying, right, what are our company's goals relative to those frameworks? What we're going to do with the company in the future, what our approach to innovation is, um, elements of regulatory ease of access, and then really planning your map. There's what I know from the ITG, the International Trade Group, is there's no single recipe. I think everyone around that table would agree with that. So you've got to figure out what strategy for international trade best suits your company its goals, its type of product or technology or service, and take it from there.
Andrew, that's great stage advice, and just some common sense around it up. Certainly from a trade agreement perspective, GCC is very much on the government's agenda. There's a lot going on there as well. US, obviously, depending on which way the wind's blowing. But last time Trump was in, we got to a stage where we actually saw some text of a trade agreement. We've generally, as a sector, we've been, I guess, fortunate in that products tend to be zero or very low tariff
Yes.
under WTO. So the trade agreements themselves are don't perhaps haven't got quite the capacity to transform the sector, but equally there are other barriers that we can address, and so we're particularly interested in members' views at the moment on some people are taking a pragmatic view that 10% on US goods isn't bad, except we're used to dealing with things less than that. Our view and the view of colleagues in organisations around the world, AdvaMed and MedTech Europe, is you should take health tech products out of tariffs and out of any countermeasures. If you get to this before the 1st of May, please do have a look at the proposed list of countermeasures, the tariffs that have been proposed by government. We will give those high-level messages back that it's keep health products out of there. But if there are any particular codes of concern, we're really keen to hear about those. And we do have regular catch-ups with DBT, and they giving weekly briefings back to Permanent Secretary at the moment on the tariff situation. And yes, the bit on rate, we always come back to it all to talking about regulation on these calls, because regulation and regulatory harmonisation, as you so eloquently put today, Andrew, the biggest facilitators of trade in this sector. So
I agree.
Thank you. And I think we'll probably want to do this again before too much longer. Excuse me, as the tariff situation plays out.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we'll put all the relevant links in the introduction that goes with this. Thank you, Andrew, on behalf of all of us, for the incredible work and leadership you're showing in International Trade Group, and we look forward to seeing progress in the group over the next year.
Absolutely, and thank you to the members that already support the group, and new members are always welcome. So we really want to make sure we've got the broadest spread of inputs and that we focus on the goals that matter to the majority of the members, if not all the members.
Andrew, great.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.